Episode 6. Who was in the music room? It wasn't easy for Bessie to leave her grandmother, who raised her instead of her parents, but she knew that her grandma would get better treatment from doctors in Chicago with the help of the Smith family. Bessie didn't head to school directly. Instead, she stopped by a bank first. She took a queue number and went to the counter. The bank teller was stunned when she casually placed her black card on the countertop. She stared at it for a while before stammering. I will go and get our manager. I don't have the authority. Bessie's fingers casually tapped away on the counter. I just need to make a transfer. Most customers who held a black card wouldn't come in personally to make any transactions. The bank usually settled things on their behalf. Bessie transferred a sum of money, and the manager personally walked her to the door when she was done. The bank wasn't far from the school. It was less than a 10-minute walk. Bessie thanked the Smith family driver and told him to head back. The driver looked at the smiling bank employees and found it odd that she came here, since the Smith family had never come before. But he didn't question her. Bessie took the shortest route to school. It was a sweltering afternoon.
Where's the hotel Mr. White was talking about?
Samuel Bright's ear stud reflected the bright sunlight. Michael was following behind him. The sun was bright and glaring, yet the black top he was in didn't make him feel uncomfortable or stuffy. Instead, he looked quite chill. He was practically unreadable, but still good-looking. He was about to find a shady tree to wait under while Samuel asked for directions, when he saw a few people with brightly colored hair standing at the corner of the road, all surrounding one person. She was wearing a bright bow-high jacket. She looked calm and unbothered. Michael paused. When Samuel was done asking for directions and hung up, he saw the scene. The few students surrounding the single person looked roughly 18 or 19 years old and had cigarettes sticking out of their mouths. He glanced at her long legs before shifting his eyes to her face. Michael furrowed his brows.
You go over.
Saving a damsel in distress was something Samuel wouldn't mind doing. He rolled his sleeves up a little and fixed his hair, but before he was done, someone kicked him in his calf. He turned around and saw Michael with both hands in his pockets, looking at him with contempt.
Hurry up, what are you waiting for?
Samuel hurried towards that girl.
Hey, you're a student from Bright Bow High. Why are you out here playing no-show?
The leader of the gang puffed a ball of smoke in Bessie's face and chuckled. He looked mean. Bessie responded rather seriously. No, I requested a leave. The few kids seemed a bit stunned. This wasn't a response they'd ever expected. Bessie took a step back. She placed her backpack on the pavement. Samuel was not there yet. Bessie then removed her school jacket, revealing a plain white t-shirt. Then her fair and thin elbows, and finally, her slender fingers. Michael watched her from where he stood. When she put her bag down, she glanced at him for a split moment. There was a brief eye contact, and all Michael could see was how pretty her eyes were, and in them, a rebellious teenager. His brows were knitted together as he heard that rather pretty girl say, I'll give you guys a chance. One of the smokers reached out to grab her by the elbow.
Whoa, how about we give you a chance instead? Come with us and...
Bessie took one more step back and kicked that guy in the stomach. He staggered backwards for a few steps, but was supported by his friends. He bent over in agony. One of the kids quickly stepped forward, trying to stand up for him. But he'd have to get a hold of her first. Bessie swiftly turned her body and avoided his grip. Before he knew it, she'd grabbed his collar and punched him hard in the face. He fell backward and reached to touch his nose, and all he saw was blood. Bessie didn't stop there. The last boy tried to punch her in the stomach, but she outsmarted him and grabbed his wrist before shoving her whole body weight at him. The scene was pretty quiet. Even Michael had not fully reacted to the situation. The four hooligans, who were at least half a head taller than Bessie, were now heaving and catching their breaths. One was on the ground, another was bleeding, and yet another was puking bile. Bessie clapped her hands together as a sign that she was done, went back to grab her jacket and her bag. She walked past that group of kids and furrowed her brows slightly, as if thinking about something. She then whistled at the gang leader and laughed. Thank you, Michael heard her say as she passed him. Samuel had to close his mouth because his jaw dropped. He was annoyed as he watched Bessie walk to the school gate.
I was the one who was going to save her. Why did she thank you?
Michael slowly looked at him and said,
Let's go. Her tactics didn't seem that unorthodox, but I couldn't tell what it was either.
it was 1 person to 4, and she'd easily beaten them with clean, swift moves. As they walked past the 4 boys, Samuel paused for a moment and commented,
Kids, that was so not cool of you.
Michael looked in the direction Bessie walked in. Looked like she was headed towards the reception office. They walked to a cafe deep in the alley.
Mr. White.
Samuel called out as a man was placing his order. Principal White smiled and said something briefly before turning to Michael.
Michael, what are you doing here?
When Principal White first knew that he was going to work as the school doctor, he had shaken his head in dismay. He knew that this man wasn't that easy to please. He smiled.
Just here to have a look.
He then changed the subject.
I heard that Mr. White had been working here for 3 years and became the school's principal. I just wanted to see for myself. What's there to look at her?
Principal White smiled, but couldn't hide his sadness.
I've found a successor.
Even Michael was shocked, not to mention Samuel. If those in the capital knew that Mr. White had found a successor, it would be a huge deal.
Who is it, sir? Is it your grandson?
Samuel didn't hide his curiosity.
That person doesn't wish to take over.
Principal White shook his head but didn't say anything else. Samuel widened his eyes in disbelief. Michael sipped his tea quietly and didn't probe. Samuel could barely contain his curiosity. Bessie went to the reception office to get her luggage. It had already arrived at Bright Bow High the day before Grace and her arrived in the city. There were 2 huge and heavy pieces of luggage, too heavy for her to handle on her own. Seeing that she was alone, the man in the reception office kindly offered to help her move her items to her room instead. Bessie had applied for a room on the 2nd floor, near the end of the corridor, room 216. It was a 6-bed room, but only 3 beds were taken so far, while the other 3 were full of other people's belongings. The beds by the windows were already occupied, so Bessie picked the bed with the least things piled on it. She then went to get a bedsheet. She opened one luggage bag and unpacked her clothes and everyday items, neatly arranging them in her wardrobe. As for the other luggage, she simply stuffed it under the bed without even opening it. After packing her belongings and having her meal, she still had about a half hour to spare before her first afternoon class. She walked past the arts building on the way to her classroom. The windows were open on the 2nd floor, and she could see the musical instruments in the room. Bessie went up to the 2nd floor. There were a few people around, and it was very quiet. She opened the door to the music room and saw a violin right in the middle. She loved the violin. It made her feel peaceful. She'd look for a place to play the violin every once in a while.
Kenneth, I'm being serious. That new student is so damn pretty. A whole class was staring at her.
Paul got excited as he spoke, holding a can of Coke in his hand. No one mentioned that she was Anne's sister. Kenneth wasn't listening to Paul. He was holding a cup of vanilla milk tea that he got for Anne in his hand. His handsome features were exuding a certain coldness, making it clear that he was uninterested in the new student that Paul was talking about. They walked past the arts building. Kenneth suddenly stopped in his tracks. A mellow, melancholic violin melody was playing. He looked up at the 2nd floor and his eyes lit up. Paul didn't know much about music and simply had his eyes on Anne because she was a popular girl. The music made him feel a little uncomfortable, not because it wasn't a good tune, but because the heaviness he could hear in it tugged at his heartstrings. He was about to say it sounded pretty good when he saw Kenneth turn away and walk towards the building. Paul was stunned for a moment before moving to catch up.
Kenneth, where are you going?
Kenneth didn't respond, but quickened his steps. He opened the door to the music room. The melody abruptly stopped. The music room was empty and the windows were open. Kenneth paused.
Where did this person go?
Paul found it odd too. They were hearing the music just a moment ago. He walked towards the window and said,
Could he possibly have jumped from the 2nd floor?
Kenneth didn't say a thing, but his eyes shifted from the open windows to the violin in the middle of the room. He only snapped out of it when someone entered for practice. He leaned against the piano casually and suavely, asking the girl who'd just entered,
Did anyone come in at noon for practice?
The girl looked confused. Kenneth repeated his question. The teacher didn't plan any practice sessions at noon. The girl looked at Kenneth cautiously and stammered, "But only Anne knows how to play the violin." Kenneth was stunned for a moment, but didn't respond. His handsome features were rather warm and kind, but his eyes were strikingly cold, making him unapproachable. He said nothing more, walked out of the music room and headed for the class to hand Anne her milk tea. But she wasn't in the classroom. Kenneth thought for a bit before deciding to just leave it on her desk. Most of that class's students were already used to his presence every now and then, but a lot of them still had their eyes on him. Meanwhile, Paul was casually leaning against the doorframe and making small talk with the girls sitting in the first row. Seeing that Kenneth was leaving the classroom, he smiled.
Do you think it was Anne who was in the music room just now?
Kenneth didn't respond to that question because it was a mystery for him too. Will schoolmates ever get to know that Bessie is the girl of many talents? Is the jittery feeling felt by Kenneth a signal of a blooming mystery or romance?